So we're just getting things ready for the CDFM study group, and we'll start at 11:30. Can I? Can you hear me, Maria? Actually, let me turn up the volume. Actually, let me turn up the volume. Actually, let me turn up the volume. Okay. Are you on my YouTube or was this through LinkedIn? I was trying something, but I hear echo. Let me turn this off. Yeah, it makes it echo. So I'm gonna turn the LinkedIn off. But okay, your question was, what is the subject? All right, so today we're going to finish up the CDFM module 2.1, and I think we stopped on page 2160. Okay, and let me call. Okay. Somebody try to call me. All right, I'll be right with you. Hey, Maria. Yeah, I had it muted because I was trying to call in because I have a teleconference number also. So I was calling in on the teleconference just for those individuals who cannot get on YouTube, for instance. So I got one more thing I need to, I'm trying to capitalize on the technology. So let me see if I can log on this way. Okay. Do you have audio where you could speak? And if not, what I might do is give you the call-in number because I know sometimes these technology they have a delay. Okay, no audio. Okay, all right. Let me give you. Okay, so you can call. All right, I'm gonna type in the call-in number. So if you would like to call in, so at least we can hear the voice. All right, so 665279924. Okay, so that's the 800 number and the PIN. So if you call in that number, then you'll be able to hear me. So you may have to turn down the voice on your computer. Sometimes that delay, it makes it harder to understand. So I have 11:30 and I'm about prompt to start on time. So let me see what this one's doing. Live completion. All right, let me go ahead and do this. And I'll wait for you to call in. And I think, let's see who else. I see someone else on here. For the other individual who's also on here, you can also call that same number, the conference number. If you don't have the ability to speak on here, maybe you want to be able to ask questions and not type it, you're welcome to call in the conference number, or you can just listen. Some people also prefer that. I will give my disclaimer with this information. If you've never read over it, it's going to sound difficult. It's going to be, might be difficult for you to understand what I'm talking about, because I always advise individuals to read through the material first before coming to these study sessions. To budget process. So I'm typing for somebody else here. All right, so news feed and story. Okay. And post. All right, let's get down to business. So I think that one's post. All right, here we go. Okay, so Maria, are you going to call in? Or you just prefer to type? Type. Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do first is, before we begin on page 2.1.60, is we're going to go over some of the background information. So the beginning half of this section. So it actually took about 3 sessions to get through all the material because it's a lot of it. And module 2 seems to be the most difficult for people to pass. Difficult in the sense that there's a lot of key players involved. There's a lot of personnel involved, documents, and you have to be able to decipher one from the other. And so, let me make sure. Okay. All right. And you have to make sure that if you picture taking a 1,000 word puzzle, and you have to take all those pieces and put all those pieces where they belong. That is what this exam is about. If you've never taken any portions of the exam, what you will find when you take your first one is you have to understand the process. The questions are not going to come directly. All right, what's the definition of obligation? It's not going to be that straightforward. It's going to give you a scenario where it uses that obligation process or whatever that process is, and then you have to decide, okay, what part of the process is it? Because this is a DoD exam, that means we're discussing things that happen at the Department of Defense level and higher. So this will not be typically what most of us deal with on a day-to-day basis. For those that are online, have any of you taken any portions of this exam in the past? And I'll just pause. If you could type your answers down at the bottom for me, I greatly appreciate it. So have you taken either module 1 or 3 of this exam before, or have you taken 2 before? So I have 1 for no, 1 for yes. Okay. And okay, so you've taken 1 and 2. And I'm sure the individual who took 2 will tell you, yeah, this is the most difficult. Is it doable? Yes, it is. Can I get you there? Yes, I can. But I cannot put the information in your head. I can break it down to you so you can understand it better. I can tell you tricks and trades and how to remember these things, but you're going to have to review the material. Repetition is important, meaning the first time you read through this material, you need to read everything like it's a novel. The second time you read it, you want to read it and then you make notes. I like hard copy. That's why I ordered the hard copy instead of the digits, because I like to write notes off to the side. Do not, because I see students do this all the time, or individuals studying, do not highlight everything in the book. And then you got this pretty color, Christmassy looking red, white, blue, pink highlights on the on your study guides. So this is Helen Thomas. I'm just doing an overview because the rest of what we have is not as much. So make sure that you review the material beforehand. So the second time when you go through, you're making notes off to the side based on the information you read. What do you find that's important in that section? You write it off to the side. Then the third time you read through the material, you're just looking at the topic and you're focusing on the information that you wrote to the side, whatever side of the paper that you wrote it. Because the fourth time, remember repetition, the fourth time you look at the information, you should be able to just look at the topic, close the page, hide the page, close the book, and be able to sit there and articulate. Okay, if I say, like I'm on page 2.1.7, the Defense Resource Management Introduction, once I get to that page, I see, okay, what is it, DoD mission? I should be able to close that and articulate what's the purpose of the Department of Defense, because that would then determine why we get funded the resources that we do, the money, the appropriations, the manpower, the equipment, why we get the things we do in the order that we do, why some individuals, some commands get more funding than the other. There's a madness behind it. And it all starts by understanding what the mission is. So we're going to do that. So again, I love it when you guys come on and participate in the study group, but don't waste your time coming on if you've never read the material or looked at it before, because I promise you, I'm going to bore you because I can't spruce this material up any nicer than it is. Maybe a few jokes here and there, but I'm not a joke teller. So that's it. All right. So before I actually dive into the material, so I have some people on the phone line, some on the YouTube. So for those on the phone line, if you want to also log on to my YouTube, I'm also there live. So some people like to look and talk at the same time and ask questions. All right. So let's begin. So I'll tell you I wanted to do last week, we finished up on page 2.1.60. But what I normally like to do for module 2, because it's the most difficult, is I recap. And that's exactly what you want to do also when you are studying. Do not continue a new section if you can't remember what you studied in the past, because all the study guide is doing is building on the information that you've already studied and reviewed. Another reminder with this study, guys, is just because the information is not directly in the study guide does not mean you may not see it on the exam. So that's why you have to know the information that's in the study guide. What do I mean? I've had people come back and say, hey, they asked about XYZ, but I couldn't find it nowhere in the study guide. I'm going to contact ASMC. And I already will tell you what ASMC is going to say. Well, look in the front, the back of this study guide. Do you see all those references that we list? They expect you to review all those references. And I guarantee whatever question was asked could be found in one of those references. I do not go through the references, but can you just study what's in the study guide, understand it, comprehend it, and pass? Definitely yes. So it takes dedicated time for you to review the material. All right, so I'm starting over, just kind of reviewing some of the things we already talked about in the beginning. So we talked about the mission. So I do not go page by page. All I'm going to do is focus on the key areas that you need to understand. So let's jump to page 2.1.10, which is the Department of Defense structure. Because as you can see how things are situated in the structure, we're going to talk about each one. And you're going to have to know, okay, you got the Office of the Secretary of Defense, you got the Joint Chief of Staff. Who's the Joint Chief of Staff? Not the person's name. What's the purpose of the position? Why are they important in this process? The planning, programming, budget, and execution. So before we begin, what I did, if you want to take notes, when we started this section, what I told everyone is let's flip to page, let me see if I can find it. Flip to page 2.1.27. And again, I cannot sell you or provide the study guide. I always direct everyone to ASMC. I don't want ASMC coming after me saying that I'm distributing. Nope. All this is a study aid for people who already have the study guides. So on page 27, if you're there, let me see if I can hold up my copy. It's the one with the little circles on it. Let's see if you can see it. Looks like this, the little circles. All right, so the reason I want to take you there first before we begin the section is because you need to understand that the Department of Defense have 3 systems that we use to keep things running. 3 systems that overlap. So the decision support system. So from the bottom left circle, it's called the Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System, JCITS. What JCITS does, what that system does is based on what the country's mission is, and they say the defense mission needs to be, then we need to find out what type of capabilities do we have? Can we meet that strategy? And then by going through that analysis, we also identify what capability gaps do we have? What are we missing in our inventory that we need to build or buy or we need funding for? So the bottom left circle on page 2127 is JCID system, identify capability gaps. The top right, which most should be familiar with, is the PEEPS process, PPBE, planning, programming, budgeting, and execution. And so from 2009 till about 2012, I used to teach this at Fort Jackson. So that's what made me get into this information, because I was able to decipher the P process. So in the P process, that's the process we use to request the funding, request the budget, request approval for the programs to within whatever capability. So if we don't have if we have the capability, we just need money funding, we go to the P process. The bottom right circle on 27 is the acquisition system, meaning the capability gap we identify in the JCID system, we don't have it already. Just having money is not going to do it. We need to build it. So we need to go to the acquisition system to do that. And if you look on that page, you see that the three circles, they overlap. And in the middle of the three circles, they overlap to meet the National Defense Strategy. So for those who are just joining in the YouTube, if you look through some of the notes ahead, I also have a teleconference on the phone line. If you can't hear me that good on the YouTube, you're welcome to call in on the teleconference number. And you are welcome to ask questions. They are very helpful. All right, thank you, Ms. Oh, is it Pratika Baba? All right. Thank you so much for that. All right, you're very welcome. You're very welcome. All right, so again, bottom left circle, JCID's identify capability gaps. The PEEB at the top is where we request our resources, our funding, approval for the programs. And the defense acquisition system is if we need to do research, if we need to procure the items, if we need to develop the items, we use the acquisition process. And all three systems work together to fulfill the Department of Defense mission and build the National Defense Strategy. All right, so I'm flipping back now to the beginning of this section. And the reason I do that again is because it doesn't make sense for me to continue where we left off at, because the meat and potatoes of this section is in the beginning, all the key players. So let's go to page. All right, that's page 12. Let's see. Yes, page 2112. So what 2112 talks about is the structure of the Joint Chief of Staff. All right, who can tell me, either on the phone line on YouTube, what is the function of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or the chairman, or even the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff? Let's go with the chairman. Anyone on the phone line? And then I can share it. What is the function of the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff? All right, I don't hear anyone chiming in. All right, so the function, so think about it. Your president is a civilian. Your Secretary of Defense is a civilian. Your top military individual is the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So what's the duties and responsibilities of your chairman? The chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the military advisor, right? You want a subject matter expert. If a civilian, military. So the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the senior military advisor to the president, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council. And we're going to talk about the council in a little bit. So know that. You also see on page 12, the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 is the law that created the position for the chairman. Because what that means is each services you have Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines and so forth. They all had representatives in the joint staff, but they didn't have that one spokesperson. So it wasn't until 1986 that position was created. the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So that's what the Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986. So every time you say Goldwater-Nichols Act, you say Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986. So that way your memory you will remember that it's 1986 that goes with it in case you see something differently. All right, so what are some of the duties and responsibilities of the Joint Chief of Staff? So let's see. Yeah, all right, so that's on the bottom of page 12 and 13. What I want to point out on page 13 is the middle to the bottom, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. The reason is that individual is going to come up again in several positions. So remember, don't forget those three circles, the three DoD support systems, JCITS, PPBE, and the Defense Acquisition System. So the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, if you look through all the roles and responsibility other than being a Vice Chairman, the one I want to point out is the last bullet that says acts as Chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. So remember when we looked at the circles for JCITS? If you look on that same circle, you'll see that the JROC, Joint Requirements Oversight Council, who's chaired by the Vice Chairman, have oversight of the JCITS process. So as you're studying, you come to a process, you come to a process, you want to know who's responsible for that process. What's the end result? What's going on? What's the end result of that process? So the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the Chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. What's the Joint Requirement Oversight Council? That is the council responsible for doing that analysis in the JCITS to identify capability gaps. You see how all that information, just from me saying Vice Chairman. Again, I reiterate, if you're going to plan to participate in the study groups, you have to read through the material ahead of time, even if you don't understand it, because you would have already heard the words that I'm saying, and it won't be so boring or difficult to comprehend. And I've been doing this long enough to know that some people, once they don't look at it, you hear it, you don't really understand what I'm saying. So appreciate it. All right, so do we have any questions thus far? Let me pause here. Okay, we'll go ahead and drive on. All right, so that's the Vice Chairman. All right, on page 14, another important group of individual is the combatant commanders, because again, we're talking about budget process. Why does the budget flow the way it does? It's based on structure. So your combatant commanders, you have those 10 unified combatant commanders, because let's see what it says it before I say it. The chain of command, the operational chain of command runs from the president to the Secretary of Defense to these combatant commanders. I repeat, operational chain of command runs from the president to the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commanders. But remember again, you're chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. As the top military advisor or the subject matter expert, the communication of the orders of the president and the SecDef goes through the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff to the combatant commanders. All right, do I need to repeat that? Sounds good. A lot of moving pieces. All right, so those on the phone line, do I need to repeat anything that I just mentioned? YouTube, do I need to repeat anything? All right, so we'll drive on. So what I just mentioned about the operational chain of command, okay, I'm going to repeat it again. Okay, yes, Ms. Francine. All right, so remember, we talked about the chairman, the president, and the Secretary of Defense being civilians. We talked about the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is a military person. That's the top military individual in the government. So your top military individual is the advisor, military advisor to the president and the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Council that we're going to talk about a little later. So now I introduce another key player is the combatant commanders. If you look on page 2.1.15, the second paragraph under combatant commands, it says, and I'll read it, the operational chain of command runs from the president to the SecDef to the commanders of the combatant command. So that's for operation. So if you notice, the combatant commands are in charge of NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, and AFRICOM, and all of those comms that's on page 14. When it comes to the resources, that's how it flows. But what I wanted to point out to you here is that, remember, don't forget about your chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. Although he's not in the operational chain of command, because he's my subject matter expert, the combatant commands communicate through the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. So the orders of the president, the orders of the Secretary of Defense go through the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff to the combatant commanders. So hopefully I made that a little bit clearer, but that's just understanding who these people are. All right, so page 16 goes into your National Security Council. So think about, most people, if you're associated with the military long enough or the DOD long enough, you're familiar with the term op order, operation order. So think of it, keep that in mind as we go through this process. So you have the National Security Council. That is made up of, on page 17, the regular members. So the president that's his council members. The president, the vice president, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and Secretary of Energy. Those are the primary members. So you got to know that. You also know, if you look on the second part, the statutory advisors, we already talked about the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is a military advisor. And then you have the Director of National Intelligence, which advises on intelligence. And then you have some other participants that may participate. I don't really focus on those. I want to know who are the primary members and advisors. So the purpose of the National Security Council, what they do with the president and all those guys, is they sit and they analyze what is going on in the country, what is going on in the world, period. And then they decide what are the priorities of that command. What is the priority of the government for whatever that period is? And once the priorities are identified, you go to page 18, they develop the National Security Strategy. So the National Security Council develops the National Security Strategy. That strategy document is your big op order. So we usually get an operation order from higher, and then we look through that operation order to see what applies to us. So the Department of Defense does the same thing. They take the National Security Strategy and they figure out, okay, flipping all through the pages, what are the defense-related things that we need to look at to be able to meet that national security strategy? So on the bottom of page 18 goes into the defense analysis process. The National Defense Strategy is a 4-year strategy. Think about the circles that we looked on page 27. Yes, page 27. Remember, in the middle of the circle where they overlap is where they meet the National Defense Strategy. In that National Defense Strategy on page 19, it's telling you, okay, some things that are included is the Defense Strategic Guidance is included. You have the National Military Strategy document included, and the Strategy for Homeland Security, Homeland Defense, and Civil Support. What I want to point out on page 19 is the second to last paragraph. The National Military Strategy that's in the National Defense Strategy is developed by the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. Why? Because it's military. Top military advisor, develops the National Military Strategy, or the NMS document. He packages it. It goes with the Homeland Security and the strategic guidance, and all of that data is then used to develop the National Defense Strategy. Any question there? So this part of it is going to be fast because I've already went through this. So I'm just kind of recapping. All right, so on page 20, they kind of briefly talk about the P process, planning, programming, budgeted, and execution. Gives you an overview, the purpose of the P process, you need to know, and so forth. Some of the key players. So what I want to do, okay, on page, let's see if I want to do it like this. Page 22, it talks again about the Joint Chief of Staff. We already talked about. We talk about the purpose of the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff in the middle, where you have the 3 bullets. They talk about it again. So a lot of this information is repetitive, so that's why I'm not focusing there. The bottom of 22, we actually talked about, because we talk about the JCID circle, the bottom left circle in that 3 circle is the chairman. The vice chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the chairman of the Joint Requirements Oversight Council, the JROC, and that entity is responsible for the JCID's analysis. All right, check on learning. Who's responsible for the JCID's process? All right, if you know the answer, you could type it in, or on the phone line, feel free to share. Who is responsible for the Joint Requirement, no, the JCIS, Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System? Come on now, this is a study group. Y'all got to participate. All right, the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff and the Joint Requirements Oversight Council. All right, let us flip to page 29. That begins the planning process of PPBE. So it tells you what the purpose is of planning, which I'm not going to read to you. On page 30 goes some more information. What I want you to do is go to page 31. All right, page 31. And whenever you get to a phase again or process, the first question you need to ask is who is responsible for that process? So the question that we need to answer is who is responsible for the planning phase of P? The answer is not directly in front of you, but that's why we flip back and forth. If you hold that page, hold page 31 and flip back to page 24, and you see the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and if you read that first bullet, it says conduct and coordinate the planning phase of the PPBE process. So when you're studying, this is what you want to be able to do, is relate the information. And just pick, if you could just picture and I would advise, this is how I was able to understand the information. I took a blank sheet of paper, as you can probably see some of my paper here. And as I'm understanding the process is, okay, planning phase of P, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is in charge of the planning. I wrote it down and kind of build a process map as you go through the material. And then eventually it'll make it a little bit easier to understand. So there are some other key players, but I want to show you where they come into play. So planning phase, we're done there. In the planning phase, on page 33, they talk about a document called the Integrated Priority List. So what's the first question you're supposed to ask when you see something new? Somebody type that in for me, or say it on the phone line. Who is responsible for this? The Integrated Priority List, if you read it, the first sentence says, each combatant commander prepares a high priority list. Anytime you hear the word integrated priority list, automatically you should say combatant commanders, because they're the only one that produce an IPL. So remember, those 10 combatant commands, they don't have their own resources. So they have to tap in, and they have to let Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, whoever is responsible for that asset, is they have to get involved in their PPBE process to get what their requirements. So the IPLs are the documents that the combatant commands package to identify what their needs are. And it's on page 33. It also tells you who they send it to. They send a copy to the Secretary of Defense. And if I ask you, why do they send it to the Secretary of Defense? Why do the combatant commanders send documents to the Secretary of Defense? And that one I'm waiting for an answer. Any takers? Why does the combatant commander send a copy of the documents, the IPLs, to the Secretary of, the Secretary of Defense? Okay. The reason is because operational chain of command, don't forget, no matter how many people you have to report to in a chain of command, you have to make sure that your direct chain of command gets a copy and your indirect chain of command. So the direct chain of command is the Secretary of Defense, President, Secretary of Defense, combatant commanders. Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, we communicate the orders of the President and the SecDef through the Chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, so he gets a copy. The military departments, because remember I said combatant commanders do not own, they have a responsibility of a region, but they do not own all the resources. So the IPLs may have something related to a particular military department. So that is the reason why a copy of the IPLs go to each of those individuals. So remember, anytime you hear the word integrated priority list, the next thing is combatant commanders produce that. That's their priority list. All right, page 34 is the programming phase of PEEB. First question you ask yourself, who is responsible for the programming phase of PEEB? I will direct you back to the Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. Let me find where he is. He's on page 26, 2126. Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. And if you read, let's see, he prepares and publishes the DoD fiscal guidance, the DoD programming guidance, the programming decision documents, and the future year defense program. And we'll talk about the FIDEP in a little bit. But back to page 34, the programming phase of PEEB is the responsibility of the Director of CAPE, Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation. So while you're going through the PEEB process, he's updating on page 36, 37, the Future Year Defense Program. You see the diagram on page 37. The FIDEP is the DoD database that keeps track of all the process, all the resources, all the programs within the Department of Defense, the type of appropriation required to do that job, and the service that has responsibility. So if you look at, I'm a visual person, so if you look on page 37, where it has a picture of the Future Year Defense Program, this is the only one that mentions the word database. Future Year Defense Program is a DoD database. And if you look at the picture, you'll be able to remember what things go in that database. Who is responsible for updating the FIDEP? The Director of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation, the DK. Still moving along. Again, this is a review, so that's why I'm kind of going fast, but you do have the ability to ask question. So as we go through each one of the planning, the programming, the budget, and the execution, the DCAPE is updating the FYDP, the Future Year Defense Program. The budgeting phase of PEEB, let's see, one key thing I want to point out, at the end of the programming phase on page 40, the final document that the DoD publishes at the end of the programming phase is the Resource Management Decisions, the RMDs. So you want to know if that phase, who's responsible for that phase, what's going on in it, and what's the final output. What's the final document? The RMD, Resource Management Decision. The budgeting phase begins on page 41. So the question you ask is, who is responsible for the budgeting phase of PEEB? And I will also tell you that's the same person that's responsible for the execution phase. So on page 23, you see the Undersecretary of Defense Comptroller. So everybody should have gotten that one right, because we know the comptroller, USD comptroller, is in charge of the budgeting phase of PEEB. And you see that at the fourth bullet from the bottom, budget formulation and execution, contract audit, finance and accounting, DFAS, all of that's rolled up under the USD comptroller, the chief financial officer for the Department of Defense. So the budgeting phase of PEEB on page 41, it tells you that late May-June timeframe, the DCAPE and the USD comptroller will send out guidance for the programming phase and guidance for the budgeting phase. Why they send out guidance? Because they are responsible for that process. And we know on 42, the budgeting phase, they call it the budget estimate submission, the BESS. All right, so on page 44, what I want to point out is, remember we talk about the Future Year Defense Program, that's the DoD database that ties together all those programs, the various appropriations, and the various services together. In the budgeting phase, not only is the Future Year Defense Program being updated, but the budget side of the house, they have a system that they use also, a system of record, which is the Comptroller Information System. So that's on page 44. So in the budgeting phase of PEEB, they update the FYDP, DCAPE updates the FYDP with all the updated numbers, and also the budget folks have a system that they update, which is the Comptroller Information System. Okay. All right, within the budgeting phase, so the next question, all right, so the budget has been created. What does the law say about when the budget needs to be turned in? On page 48, 49, it goes into the president must submit the budget to Congress no later than the first Monday in February. That's on page 48. Then once the president submits the budget to Congress, page 49 are the actions, and I think 49 and 50, are the actions that Congress takes once the president submits the budget no later than the first Monday in February. Then Congress have congressional actions. So in the bottom of 49, it says the first action once Congress gets the budget is the concurrent budget resolution. Remember, in your Congress, you have the House and the Senate. So together, they have to decide what guidelines they're going to use to review the federal budget. So that's what their concurrent budget resolution is all about, where the House and the Senate decides the limitations, the guidelines they're going to use. The concurrent budget resolution does not have to go to the president to be signed. Page 50, after the concurrent, then they go through the authorization process. And while I'm here, what I want to point out, and I think they mentioned it, actually, if you go back to page 49, let me point out that first paragraph. As I mentioned when I started this session, not everything that you need to pass this test is going to be just in this section. So if you look at the top of page 49, They even tell you, you need to go to Module 1, Competency 1, Government Resource Management section to get more information, because that section has more details in what happens at the concurrent budget resolution, the authorization, and the appropriation. What do you need to know? I will tell you for 49, you need to know for the concurrent budget resolution, which House and which Senate is responsible for that process. And it's, for lucky for you, it's the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee that's responsible for the concurrent budget resolution. The next one on page 50 is the authorization process. Okay, which House and which Senate is responsible for the authorization process? That's the House and Senate Armed Services Committee. They are responsible for the congressional authorization process. The purpose, why do we have the authorization process? The sole purpose of the authorization process is to authorize the programs. Remember when I talked about the 3 circles and we talked about PEEB, I said if we want the resources, is we have to go through the PPBE process to get authorized the programs and authorize the funding. The authorizer's only function is to authorize the program. So even if funding is listed in the authorization law, because it goes to the president to be signed, we do not have budget authority in the authorization process. We get our budget authority from the appropriation process, and the House and Senate appropriation committees is responsible for the appropriations process. So what that also means is if funding is approved in the appropriation process, that is what we spend. So you may get funding in appropriation that was not even authorized in the authorization process, but again, whatever is in the appropriation process is what we spend. And budget execution is what happens after Congress appropriates the money. And I typically say this, once Congress appropriates the money, 2 things happen. The first thing is OMB goes through the apportionment process. Anytime you hear the word apportionment, OMB apportions. So OMB begins the apportionment process, and all is the same thing to us as allotment. But at the OMB level, they call it apportionment. The second and most important thing that happens after Congress appropriates the money is the Treasury issues the Treasury warrant. Why is that so important? Because if you go back to Module 1, it talks about Article 1 of the Constitution, Article 2, Article 3. It talks about the 3 branches of government. And what you will find is that Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution says we cannot get any money out of the Treasury unless we have an appropriation law in place or a continuing resolution, which is a stopgap. So the reason the government shuts down is because of Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution. Because if you don't have a CR and you don't have a budget, the law says we cannot get any money, take any money out of the Treasury. So I just thought I'd throw that in there for the budget process. So the Treasury issuing the Treasury warrant is the first legal action that occurs. All right, moving right along. On page 53, that's a good chart for you to know because you're going to see it in Module 1, 2, and 3. You must know MILPERS and O&M are annual or 1-year appropriation. Research and development, RDT&E, is a 2-year appropriation. Procurement is a 3-year, except for shipbuilding and conversion Navy, which is a 5-year appropriation, and military construction is also a 5-year appropriation. What does that mean? That means that within those timelines, those appropriations are good for obligations, new obligations. We can spend new contract, whatever we need to do. Because if you flip all the way to page 60, which is where we left off the last time, and we'll have time to finish up the rest because it goes a little bit faster. On page 60, every appropriation goes through 3 phases. Phase 1 is what we discussed on that chart. They're good for new obligations. They're current in phase 1. Phase 2 is when they are in the expired state. What can you do when an appropriation is in the expired state? All you can do is upward and downward adjustments. You can make adjustments, but no new contracts in the phase 2 or the expired state. Every appropriation stays in the expired state for 5 years. So like we said, military constructions was a 5-year current appropriation. When it expires for an additional 5 years. What happens when they enter phase 3, closed or canceled? When they're closed or canceled, the funding that you have returns to the miscellaneous receipts account in the Treasury. However, you do have a stipulation in phase 3, and if you can read under the bullet under page 60, or if on page 61, the very last sentence, you can utilize. So let's say you get a bill, and we do sometimes get bills that it was current, it was expired, and now it's getting ready to close, or it's closed, and now here comes an invoice that somebody wants to get paid. It says that you can use up to 1% of current appropriation, that's what it's saying on 61, to pay for that closed bill. Maybe your organization have an excess of that same type of appropriation, and you can use up to 1% of that current. So you do have that exception when they're canceled. But normal appropriation, once they're canceled or closed, those funds are returned to the Treasury and placed in the miscellaneous receipts account. All right, again, I'll pause here to see if anyone have any questions. Then I'll finish this up. Anybody on the phone line with questions? All right. Anyone on the YouTube? Let me see. I don't see any questions, so we'll continue. All right. So as you know, as financial managers, we can't just obligate, willy-nilly make contracts. We have to have obligating document. We have to have an approving document. Somebody senior to us that's requesting to do it. So we either have contracts or we have military interdepartmental purchase requests, commonly known as MIPRs. From the bottom of 62, it talks about direct citation versus reimbursable. And you can read through those. What I want to focus on is on page 63. You either have a project order or an Economy Act order. You need to know the differences and some of the key differences between both. If you think about a project sounds like I need to finish that complete process, so I need all my money to finish the project. Versus Economy Act. So what am I trying to say? The question you need to answer is, what do we obligate at the end of the year or not? On the project order on 63 and the bullet, it says no deobligation, the second to last bullet. So a project, because I need to finish a project, you do not obligate those funds at the end of the fiscal year. The Economy Act order, if it says that on there, you're supposed to deobligate the funds at the end of the fiscal year. The project order is used to order work or services from another DoD organization. So I do projects with other DoD organization versus Economy Act order is intra-government. That means I can have orders with another government entity. Does not have to be the Department of Defense. So when you have different things you have to compare, you need to find out what's the differences between that. Because I think this is also in Module 1, Project versus Economy Act. Contingent liability, page 64. So contingent liability typically means that the contract says, okay, if you if I deliver the items by this date, you have to pay me X amount of dollars. If not, you pay me the full amount. If there's a discount, if you pay me, let's say if you've heard the term 210 net 30, when you get to, I think that's module 3, 210 net 30, 2%. So you could take a 2% discount if you pay this bill within 10 days, or you pay the full amount at the end of the fiscal year. I mean, the end of 30 days. It must be almost time for me to wrap this up. Sorry about that. All right. So contingent liability, you have to determine, do I obligate, if you have one that says I pay them more, do you obligate the full amount, or you wait until see if they earn it and then you add the additional? So that's what they're talking about there. Termination of contract on 65, most government contracts says there's a clause in there that says the government can terminate for convenience. That's standard. And sometimes you have contracted default, meaning what it is that we contracted them for, they did not fulfill that job. They were painting, they were building, and it was not up to standard. What you have to find out is, well, I still have this requirement, so how do I get the job done? There's two things you have to do. One, as long as you do not change the scope of the work, you have to, working with the, okay, so let me go down a little slow. So termination. So the first thing is working with the contracting officer, your KO, because they work with the contractor, is they have to then determine what's the fair market value for the job that contractor has already done. If they've done, they have to be paid for the what they've already done. Then the rest of the funding can be used to get another contractor to complete the work. If you start, because some of us, we do that, we get a contract going and then we was like, oh, I didn't think of this, oh, I didn't think of that, and then we start adding things to what needs to be done, then that becomes a new requirement. So you have to then cancel that one and go and request a new requirement. So in the meantime, Ms. Hall, if you want to write down, you have a question. I always have trouble with this. Will you be providing an example? So it's no different. Let's see, because I know this happened when we were in Iraq. Is contractor. He was supposed to be building an office. That's for instance. And then once this contracting representative kept checking, and we have electrical folks that come in. Ooh, the electricity is not in right. Oh, look, the roof. There's a space between the top of the roof. Okay, that's not up to standard. So after we kept going through with that, then we realized, okay, this contractor is not doing the job we want him to do. So then we contact the contracting office. Then they contact the contractor to terminate the contract. However, again, if as the COR, you've allowed that individual to complete certain things, then working with the KO, you have to determine, should they be paid for some of the work that they've done? KO says, okay, let's pay them X amount of dollars for what they've done. You still have the requirement, but you still have a balance on that contract that you can get another bid can be sent out to get someone to come in to complete the work. In some instances, that contract, the new contractor may have to undo everything that first one did. And depending on the cost, if it exceeds, if the cost starts going much higher than what was approved, because remember, we don't approve anything. Your approving official, your funding officials approve the packet. And if they say we approve $1 million and then now you're all in 2 million, before you even do that, you may need to go back and resubmit a packet to your approving officials so that they can approve a new request. Does that answer your question, Ms. Francine? And if you have a particular question, feel free to type it in. All right, so let's see what else we have. Reimbursable, support agreements, all of that. Okay. Most of this is information you can read. So let's go to page 69 at the top. Couple things you can do with appropriation, which you should already know, but you should know the difference between a reprogramming action and a transfer of funds. And the best thing I underline, reprogram means you're still within the same appropriation. All I'm doing is reprogramming within the same appropriation and transfer out to a different appropriation. So if you put those words together, it's easier to remember. So reprogram is within the same appropriation, transfer out to a different appropriation. That's at the top. The bottom of page 69 goes into the defense working capital. Remember, you have annual appropriation, multi-year appropriation, but you also have working capital funds, revolving funds that do not expire, but they still have rules. So that's what they're talking about here. And I think if you also look in module 3, it also has some information on working capital funds to make sure you understand what this process. So working capital funds, let me give you an example, is your commissary. The commissary takes their money to buy the food items to put on the shelf. Based on what it costs them to put it on the shelf, they charge the customer X amount of dollars to buy the items. They take the funding that they get from the customer, they go buy more items to put on the shelf. So that's why you'll kind of see where the prices fluctuate from one year to the next. What I want you to know, if nothing else, from the working capital fund on 69, the goal of the working capital fund is to break even. The government is not in the business to make profit like the civilian sector. So break even. So that's why you'll see the prices for the goods are one price this year, the next year, or the next time you go back to the commissary, it's a different price, because they have to keep adjusting the prices to match what it's charging them or what's costing them, and then what it is that they have to provide or charge the customer. Okay. Page 73 at the bottom goes into, at the very bottom, you see the term apportionment and reapportionment. I mentioned anytime you hear the word apportionment, remember the next thought process should be OMB, Office of Management and Budget. And if I didn't say who OMB is, Office of Management and Budget is the resource manager for the president, is the resource manager for the executive branch. They are the top resource manager in this process. So that's why the OMB apportions the funding. So that's when you see apportionment. And the final part of this is, yes, the bottom of page 76 and 77. And 77, even though it's just words, you need to understand what each word means, because if you flip to page 79, where there's a practical exercise, you'll see that they're asking you to do a calculation. So by knowing what the definitions are of the terms on page 77, you will then be able to do the computations on page 79. These exams, the CDFM exams, do not provide you with the formulas. If there's a formula in the study guide, they're not going to give it to you. So that's why I'm telling you the best way to know it on 77 is to understand. So what does this say? So remember, Congress appropriates the money, OMB apportions, and the DOD issues allotment. And all the other agencies issues allotment. That's the order. Congress appropriates, they all begin with A. OMB apportions, DOD and the agencies allotment. Because, and 77, like it says, unapportioned appropriation. Well, if you remember the order, you know what's the step. If I haven't apportioned it yet, the step before that is appropriation. So it's saying I take the number of apportion. All right, the best way to do that, let's go to page 79. Because me just talking, yeah, it's not that easy. All right, so let's say for the first one, it says calculate the unapportioned appropriation. So to do that, you have appropriation, apportionment, allotment, obligation, and outlay. A through E are the values given to you. Even though the computation formula is given on this page where it says A minus B, you might as well hide it because they're not going to give it to you on the test. But all it's saying is you take what's already appropriated with 48 million, take out the apportionment amount of 24 million, you should be left with unapportioned appropriation of 24 million. That means I got 24 million left in my appropriation that has not already been distributed, and so forth with the other ones. The other thing on the bottom of 77 is the other type of appropriations we have is NAF, non-appropriated funds. And the most popular one we deal with, NAF fund, is the MWRs, Morale, Welfare, and Recreation. And what I want to point out on page 78 with that is the MWRs have 3 categories of funding. They get 3 types of funding. Category 1 says, and if you go all the way to the last sentence of that paragraph, it says that it gets a minimum of 85% of the total expenditures is 100% appropriated funds. So if it's a category 1, and if you read through the paragraph, it tells you what constitutes a category 1. It's 100% appropriated funding. If it's a category B, MWR activity, the last sentence says it's 65% of appropriated funds. And that means the rest of it is let's say fishing. When you go fishing on post, they charge you a fee. If you go, what else they do? Hunting, they charge you a fee. So that's where they're making up the differences. That's not appropriated. So category C do not get any type of appropriated funding. All of that is generated, and that's what I was talking about. Some of the activities, the golf courses on the installation. So all of those activities are strictly, we have it, we charge the customer, that's how we get the funding. So those are category C's. So 100%, 65%, or 0% appropriated funds are given to category A, B, or C of funding given to the MWR. All right, that looks like it. So if the good thing, make sure you do the calculation on page 79 so you can understand that process. Let's see, what's the other ones? And definitely work on the case study, the PPBE process, because remember when we went through the chart where it talks about current, expired, and closed? You can actually be given a practical exercise from that information. Because if I say, for instance, today is May 6, 2006, and I say I have RDT&E funds, when are these funds expired? Well, you have to do the calculation based on your knowledge of, okay, first you got to figure out which fiscal year am I in, which appropriation, what's the life cycle of that appropriation to tell you. So RDT&Es are 2-year appropriation. So 2006, 2007, I got my RDT&E, and then it enters the expire state in that 3rd year. So 2008. All right, so that concludes everything I have for CDFM Module 2.1. I will pause if anyone have any questions. And if not, next week we'll go over another interesting part is cost and economic analysis. And for that portion, you will have to do calculations in the cost and economic analysis. All right, I'll pause for any question. Thank you guys for coming by. Be sure to share the YouTube for those that are on YouTube, so that it'll help as you go back through the material of all the things that I discussed. All right, I'll pause here. Thank you for joining the CDFM study group. Okay, if no question, all right, you all have a wonderful week. Oh, and by the way, today's my birthday. So I'm celebrating today too. Thank you. Happy birthday to you, Miss Tana. I'm milking it today. I'm okay, Miss Francine, thank you very much. Will you be providing reminders for future study groups? Yes, ma'am. Please. Okay, Miss Francine, if you can hear me. Oh, thank you for the birthday wish. You can send me an email. Let me write my email because I have a email reminder that I send out. It's 18. That's I'm on my YouTubes if I'm still babbling on the phone here. So if you're done on the phone and you want to go, you're welcome. Okay, did you see my question? Let me go back up. All right, who's that calling me? I'm sorry, Miss Francine. I'm trying to multitask. All right. Yes, ma'am. I will. Let me write your email down. I will add you to our email distribution list. So let me write it down before I close. Sorry. Let's see. All right, I got you. Can you hear me now? Okay, and anyone else who's on the YouTube, if you want me to add you to the email distro so that you'll get the updates, I usually send it out the Monday or Tuesday before. I definitely would do that. You could type your email here, or you can email me if you look a few ahead. You can go ahead and you can either email me or if you want me to email you. All right. All right, so in the interest of time, so I can go ahead and get off of here and get back to my real job, my other job. That's what they were calling me about, get some work done. So if you send me an email, you guys send me an email, I will add you to our email distribution list. And that way I will send you a reminder so that you can go ahead and be reminded to come on next week. So thank you again for stopping by the CDFM study group. I am Helen Thomas. I'm